Good morning. This hearing will now come to order. As the hearing is fully virtual, we must address a few housekeeping matters. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If you notice you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies. If there is a technology issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You will notice a clock on your screen that will show how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn to yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I will gently tap the gavel to remind members that their time is almost expired. When your time is expired, the clock will turn red, and I will begin to recognize the other member. In terms of speaking order, we will follow the order set forth in House rules, beginning with the chair and ranking member, then members present at the time of the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority, and finally, members not present at the time of the hearing is called to order. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. Okay, that's the end of the housekeeping rules. So now we'll begin the hearing. Today, the Interior Environment Subcommittee will examine the President's fiscal year 2022 budget request for the Environmental Protection Agency. Joining us this morning is Administrator Regan. With him is Deputy Chief Financial Officer David Bloom. I believe this is Administrator Regan's first appearance before the House of Representatives since being confirmed in March. Welcome and congratulations, Mr. Administrator, and welcome back, Mr. Bloom. Earlier this month, the President outlined some of his priorities for the EPA. In FY 2022, the President is requesting $11.2 billion for the EPA, a $2 billion increase over the enacted level. Some of the highlights that we expect to see when we receive the agency's detailed budget request later this spring include increasing core operating programs by $110 million to rebuild the agency's capacity to carry out its mission to protect public health and the environment, tackling the climate crisis head-on with the urgency that this existential threat requires, placing values like equity and equal access to justice for all at the heart of the agency's policy agenda, and recognizing that advancing economic prosperity and environmental protection are not contradictory objectives, but in fact are two sides of the same coin. From my perspective, compared to what we have seen these past several years, this is a breath of fresh air. After 4 painful years, we will once again have senior leaders at the Environmental Protection Agency who see environmental protection as part of the agency's job. We will have new leaders who view scientific data as a tool to guide decision-making, not as an obstacle to be overcome in pursuit of ideological agenda, and who will use the authority of the federal government to serve the public interest rather than as a means to funnel benefits to political allies or to intimidate critics and opponents. I would like to commend the administrator for the actions he has already taken in restoring scientific integrity to the agency's processes, his commitments to act transparently and fairly with all stakeholders, and his efforts to reset the agency's relationship with this subcommittee. The budget request, combined with the investments proposed in the American Jobs Plan, position us well to address the numerous environmental and public health challenges we currently face. They are a welcome indication of the work this administration is planning on getting done. I look forward to working closely with the administrator and President Biden in achieving our shared vision for a safer, more prosperous, and more just nation. I would now like to yield to the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Joyce, for any opening remarks he would like to make. Mr. Joyce, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you for yielding, Chair Pingree. I appreciate you holding this important hearing on the administration's fiscal year 2022 budget request for the Environmental Protection Agency. I'd also like to take a moment to welcome our witnesses, EPA Administrator Michael Regan and Deputy Chief Financial Officer David Bloom. Thank you both for joining us this morning, and I hope our next meeting together can be in person. Administrator Regan, welcome to your first hearing before the Interior Subcommittee, and congratulations on your historic confirmation to serve as the 16th Administrator of the EPA. No doubt you have a tough job ahead, but given your deep understanding of EPA's programs and extensive experience in North Carolina, I expect you're up for the challenge and will serve the agency well. My colleagues and I are looking forward to working with you over the coming months to move forward a budget that provides EPA with the necessary resources to continue fulfilling its mission to protect human health and the environment. Our collaborative work starts today as we begin to discuss the agency's initial funding priorities and the goals for the year ahead. In a recent speech, you noted that every one of us has a stake in the health of our environment, the strength of our economy, the well-being of our communities, and the legacy we leave to the next generation. Administrator, I couldn't agree more. That's why I take this committee's role seriously. As appropriators, it's critical that we work together to examine the programs under our jurisdiction to ensure taxpayer dollars are spent most effectively to benefit our environment and the American people. I'm proud of the key investments we've made on a bipartisan basis to help improve our air, clean our water, revitalize our land, and support a strong economy. Unfortunately, though, based on the scale of the increases included in the administration's initial FY22 request, I have some concerns about the debt we may leave to the next generation. The FY22 request proposes over $1.5 trillion in discretionary spending, in addition to the $1.9 trillion COVID relief package and the $2.3 trillion infrastructure proposal. For EPA, the request asks for an additional $2 billion, a 21.3 increase above the FY21 bipartisan agreement. Spending at this rate is unsustainable and unaffordable. As we continue to restore our way of life and reignite our economy, following the pandemic, the federal government must be cautious to live within its means so that we don't saddle future generations with unnecessary economic burdens. Mr. Regan, I was pleased to see that the request prioritizes funding to improve our nation's aging water infrastructure and to counter current and potential sources of water contamination. And the budget request invests in the Superfund and Brownfields program to accelerate the cleanup of our nation's lands to protect the public health and return sites to beneficial use. I look forward to working with the chair to move a bill within reasonable spending limits that supports these programs along with other EPA programs that communities, states, and tribes rely on to mitigate environmental threats, bolster their recycling programs, protect their citizens, and meet federal mandates. Given the programmatic details of the requests are still limited, I'm sure we'll spend a good bit of today discussing the agency's policy initiatives, regulatory agenda, and staffing plans. I was supportive of the prior administration's common sense reforms and efficiencies developed to reduce regulatory burdens, promote American businesses, and support an all of the above energy strategy. I hope on the heels of the pandemic, this administration thinks twice about undermining these efforts, which help protect American jobs, reduce energy costs, and spur economic growth. Finally, it comes as no surprise, but I'm interested in discussing the administration's plans for the Great Lakes. The lakes are one of the country's greatest natural resources and economic powerhouses, and that's why I made it a top priority in Congress to fight for their continued restoration and protection. The Great Lakes provides more than 1.5 million jobs, supplies 90% of the nation's fresh surface water, supports over 3,500 species of plants and animals, and generates over $60 billion in wages annually. I'm very proud of the bipartisan work we've done on this subcommittee, especially under the leadership of the former chair, Ms. McCollum, to provide sustained, robust funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. The GLRI is critical to bringing together all the Great Lakes stakeholders to mitigate the impacts that human activity has had on the lakes and to address threats like invasive species, harmful algal blooms, and shoreline erosion. Administrator Regan, I'm hopeful that the FY22 request continues our investments in the GLRI and we can find ways to work together to protect the Great Lakes for current and future generations. When your schedule allows, I invite you to come and visit Lake Erie. It'll be a great opportunity to show the difference EPA-led GLRI restoration projects have had on the lake's long-term health and vitality. Thank you again for joining us this morning, Administrator. My colleagues and I look forward to working together and engaging with you further once we receive the administration's comprehensive FY22 budget proposal. With that, I look forward to our discussion and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Joyce. You had us all in suspense, leaving the Great Lakes till the very end of your opening remarks, but we're always glad to have them in there. So, Mr. Regan, thank you so much. Mr. Regan, thank you so much for being before us. We'd love to hear your opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Pingree and Ranking Member Joyce and members of the subcommittee. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to appear today to discuss EPA's discretionary funding request for fiscal year 2022. Also delighted to begin this partnership and collaborative effort. For half a century, EPA has helped provide the American people with clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and safe, healthy land. EPA's dedicated public servants at our headquarters in Washington, D.C., and throughout our 10 regions, including 7 staff members who have been with the agency since its inception, work every day to improve the lives of people across our great nation and have risen to meet the challenges presented to us as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Earlier this month, President Biden sent Congress a discretionary funding request for the EPA at $11.2 billion. We believe this request will help ensure EPA can continue to meet its essential mandate, set the stone for our nation's economic recovery, and provide the resources necessary to confront our environmental challenges, especially in our most overburdened communities. The President has seized this moment to reimagine a new American economy that leads the world in advancing clean energy, modernizes our infrastructure while enabling it to withstand impacts from climate change, and rights the historic wrongs of past environmental injustices that have held back generations of Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and low-income communities. This funding request reflects the understanding that a healthy environment and a healthy economy are not mutually exclusive. They actually go hand in hand. These investments will provide tremendous opportunity to leverage American innovation, put people back to work, and protect our communities, families, and children from environmental hazard and harm. In short, this request recognizes the profound urgency and the existential threat of the climate crisis and provides EPA with the resources essential to fulfilling our mission to protect public health and protect the environment. Ensuring access to clean and safe water for all Americans impacts our nation's climate resilience and is integral to advancing environmental justice. At EPA, we've seen that investing in water infrastructure is a win-win for public health and economic development. EPA's Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act loan has helped finance $19.4 billion in water infrastructure, creating 47,000 jobs nationwide. In 2020, the 2022 funding request of $3.6 billion for EPA rebuilds our water infrastructure, and it's an increase of more than $600 million over the FY21 enacted level. This includes targeted increases to the state revolving loan funds to assist states, tribes, and territories with infrastructure projects that help provide safe drinking water and clean water in communities across the country. Water infrastructure investments, however, represent only one side of ensuring clean and safe water. The agency will invest resources and expand efforts to address PFAS, pervasive and persistent chemicals found in our drinking water. As part of the President's commitment to tackling PFAS, the funding request provides approximately $7 million to accelerate toxicity studies and funds research to inform the regulatory developments designating PFAS as a hazardous substance while setting enforceable limits for PFAS under the Safe Water Drinking Act. Under the President's leadership, we're also heeding our call from the youth to courageously urge world leaders to fight the climate crisis with innovation, fortitude, and resolve that it demands. This budget invests in programs that will help reduce greenhouse gases, including an additional $100 million for air quality grants to states and tribes to tackle emission levels at the local and regional scale. An additional $30 million will help improve the knowledge of the impacts of climate change on human health and the environment through our research and development programs. Much like climate change, environmental justice underpins all of our work. The pandemic ignited a perfect storm for communities of color and low-income communities who already bear the highest burden of pollutions, suffer the highest rates of mortality from heart and lung disease, and now COVID-19 too. In the 40 years since the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, CERCLA, was signed into law, we have made significant progress, but much work needs to be done. Under my leadership, EPA will do everything in its power to hold bad actors accountable for environmental degradation and return land to safe and productive use for communities.
our budget provides $882 million for the Superfund remedial program, nearly $300 million more than our current budget, to clean up America's most contaminated land and reduce toxic substances and greenhouse gases from existing abandoned infrastructure. These funding requests lay down a marker that EPA is ready to meet these challenges. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to our continued partnership and welcome any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Administrator Regan. It's great to have you here, and it's great to hear you outline some of the important goals that the EPA will be taking on. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to begin the questioning. You started out, or you did some talking about climate change, but I'd like to follow up on that a little bit. I am very enthusiastic that the president has about $14 billion above the FY21 level across the federal government in his budget to support climate change investments. And of this, about $1.8 billion is going to the EPA. You've talked a little bit about some of the work that you're doing. Could you go further on that to talk about how you see the EPA's role in tackling the climate crisis, and perhaps a little bit about how you see coordinating with federal, state, and local agencies so that we can move forward together and as quickly as possible?
Well, thank you for that question, Chairwoman. And the $1.8 billion represents both climate change and environmental justice. There are resources in there to enhance our air quality grants for our states and our tribes to help them with the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act, but also the reduction of traditional pollutants as well that threaten our health and well-being. There are also resources there that will enhance the agency's knowledge and ability to quantify and address climate change pollutants on both health and the environment. And so this will double our ability to look at research and development on the topic of climate change. There are also resources in there, though, for environmental justice and accelerating environmental and economic justice in communities that have been hit the hardest, our communities that have been disproportionately impacted by climate change, as well as our tribal partners as well. So there's a combination there in that 1.8 that focuses on climate change, air quality impacts, and environmental justice.
That's great. Well, we certainly look forward to working with you on that. You also brought up the important topic of PFAS contamination, which is such a critical issue, and we continue to discover more and more about the impacts of PFAS contamination in food and water and other areas as well. So as you mentioned, there is money, a significant amount of money to address research, also to support regulatory standards for drinking water. And that's been an important issue for this committee. We've invested a little over $100 million at EPA towards those efforts. Can you talk a little bit more, I know you mentioned it, but about how you intend to use these resources, but also specifically what you have planned for drinking water infrastructure?
Absolutely. The PFAS pollution is something that I have personal experience with. In North Carolina, this was an issue that we fought for 2 or 3 years, looking at the impact that PFAS had in North Carolina for over 30 years, based on the source that we tracked it back to. It was such a pervasive issue in terms of health and human impact, but the economic impact that was caused by the uncertainty in drinking water was tremendous in the state as well. We want to use these resources, these precious resources, to do more scientific evaluation and quantification of PFAS so that we can move forward with the right regulations for our drinking water. We also want to use these resources to help assist states in the cleanup. When there is uncertainty in drinking water, communities go on bottled water for months, if not years. There are things that we need to do to help expedite the cleanup and remediation. That's what these resources are dedicated to. Research and development to set drinking water standards, but also health and safety and well-being for our states and our communities. And by the way, the $75 million is just a drop in the bucket. The state of Minnesota estimates that it could cost $250 million to $1.2 billion to clean up in its area. And North Carolina has some similar numbers as well. So this is just a tip of the iceberg, and we hope to do more.
Yeah, and I certainly concur. I think every state is already starting to understand the cleanup issues that they have, but also the drinking water standards. I don't want to put you on the spot. Luckily, there's only a few seconds left, but how long do you think it's going to take us to get to a federal drinking water standard? It's such a challenge for states now, trying to deal with this on the individual basis. It seems important that eventually we arrive at that. How long do you think that will take?
It's a top priority for this administration, and we are building on some of the work that the previous administration did, quite frankly, did not move fast enough. And so we'll have staff circle with you on the specific timeline, but we are moving in an expedited fashion because the states need some certainty. And quite frankly, our military and companies need some certainty as well.
Great. Well, I've used up more than my time, but thank you so much for your answers, and happy to yield to Mr. Joyce for 5 minutes for his question.
Well, thank you, Chair Pingree, and I will not leave you in suspense with my questions. right out of the box, Administrator Regan. When I travel around my district in Northeast Ohio, or all throughout Ohio and the Great Lakes, I consistently hear concerns about the increasing water levels in Lake Erie and their contribution to the ongoing erosion damage to shoreline communities. To provide relief to our coastal communities over the last year, I've worked with various federal agencies to try to address this problem. In doing so, I've discovered that it's going to take coordination and collaboration at the local, state, and federal level to identify long-term solutions that will help us protect our critical infrastructure, prevent further loss of land, and restore coastal habitat due to erosion. Given EPA will play a key role in these efforts, and has played a key role in FY21, I was proud Congress included language encouraging EPA to make GLRI funding available to expand breakwaters and advance local shoreline mitigation measures. Can you discuss EPA's plans in FY21 to make GLRI funding available to protect Great Lakes shorelines that are threatened by rising lake levels, and how this funding will help coastal communities?
Well, thank you for that question, Congressman. And absolutely, we will continue funding to protect the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes are a national treasure. I think that 20% of the world's surface freshwater resides there. We really need to protect the ecological integrity as well as the economic stimuli that the Great Lakes provides to so many communities. And so we have prioritized that. We're aligned there. It's my belief that climate change impacts and other, impacts are altering the topography, geography, and et cetera. And we are seeing the shorelines expand. And we believe that there are a number of natural remedies to accentuate some of the man-made remedies to prevent some of the erosion. And staff is focused on that. And we look forward to partnering with you and your team. And I look forward to accepting the invitation that you extended earlier to take a close look. When I was secretary of the Department of Environmental Quality in North Carolina, I visited 90 out of my 100 counties. I don't believe we can make these decisions sitting behind the desk. We need to get out and visit and see things firsthand. And I look forward to accepting your invitation.
And thank you. And I've asked myself what we could do by man to do this. And my understanding from the Army Corps of Engineers is, the safety valve is the Niagara Falls. So it's not like we got a hell of a lot of room to reduce the low, by ourselves, reduce the water levels. Now they fluctuated down on their own this year, thank God, but they chewed up a lot of land in the process. But can you tell me, does the FY22 request provide GLRI funding for the agency to continue the work? And beyond GLRI, are other EPA programs like Clean Water, SRF, that may help constituents like mine address these issues?
Yes, we want to continue the work and build on the work. And there are other revenue streams at the agency that we hope in concert we can collaborate with, like SRFs and others, to continue the great work that we've been doing in the Great Lakes. I think that it would be a travesty to take our foot off the gas right now. And so we need to continue to lean in. And the Army Corps has been a great partner to EPA on this effort. And again, I think that we see that there are some natural remedies there that we found through research and data that are longer lasting than some of the man-made remedies and are more cost effective. And so we believe we want to continue to work on the resiliency aspect of that as well as the economic aspect of that.
Well, thank you. Last year, I toured the Lake Guardian, EPA's largest research vessel, tasked with monitoring trends of the Great Lakes ecosystem. And I saw firsthand how critical it is to prevent waste, particularly plastics, from getting into our waterways, given some areas of Great Lakes are already experiencing high density of microplastics. That's why I've been supportive of EPA's Trash-Free Waters program, which provides resources to help communities keep trash out of U.S. waterways and prevent microplastics from entering our food supply and drinking water sources. The program is especially important now we've likely seen an uptick in pollution from disposable face masks and gloves due to the pandemic. Administrator Regan, does the agency plan to continue the trash-free water program in FY22?
Yes, we do. And the Lake Guardian is EPA's science at its best, on the ground, looking at what's happening with the Great Lakes in real time. And we are seeing the same thing that you're seeing, and we want to continue to invest there. You and I have talked about the circular economy and the role that plastics play there. And I'll tell you, whether it be the younger generation who have been pressing me on more action on plastics, or whether it be states like yours and mine who see the impacts of marine debris, we want to spend a lot more time there and a lot more effort on those issues.
And I know I'm out of time, but Chair Pingree has already held a hearing on the plastics and the oceans issues. And I got to admit, I was very surprised to find from the young scientists that it was actually into the food chain already in the Great Lakes. It's being absorbed into the meat of the fish, but it's not as bad as it has been in the ocean. And with my completely being out of time, I yield back.
Such an important topic. I'm glad you took up all the time you needed. Happy to yield to Representative Kilmer for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Administrator, for being with us today, and congratulations on your confirmation. I recognize all of the critical work that your agency accomplishes for our country, but as folks on this committee know perhaps all too well, my first and highest priority on this subcommittee remains the critical role that the EPA plays in protecting and restoring Puget Sound. Puget Sound is our region's most iconic body of water, a place on which generations of Washingtonians and Native Americans have built their lives and made their livelihoods. The Sound supports more than 150,000 jobs in fishing and shellfish harvesting and maritime industry. There are 19 federally recognized tribes that have made Puget Sound their home since time immemorial, including 17 with tribal treaty rights to harvest fish and shellfish. And the federal government has a trust responsibility to support Puget Sound recovery and uphold those treaty rights. I believe that now more than ever, there is real opportunity for Congress and the federal government to adopt policies that will protect our planet for future generations. And as our nation continues to adjust to our new normal, it's clear that major federal investments will be needed to restart our economy and get folks back to work. And I see Puget Sound restoration from addressing persistent flooding and stormwater runoff to improving nearshore habitat and removing culverts that affect water quality and fish passage as being a key component of that effort. These projects can get folks back to work and promote much needed economic activity while also accomplishing long-term goals to recover the Sound. That is a win-win. So I am hopeful that we will see some progress on this front as part of the economic recovery effort. I would also like to extend a standing invitation to you to come out and visit my neck of the woods so that you can see firsthand all of the outstanding needs as well as the opportunities that our region has. If future generations are going to have these opportunities, we've got to step up our efforts to protect and restore the Sound, and we need a strong federal partner in those efforts. So can you speak to some of the opportunities you see to strengthen EPA's partnership role in Puget Sound recovery?
Well, thank you for that question. And absolutely, for the reasons that you outlined, I think that EPA has a strong history in working on the Puget Sound, and that's work that we will continue to do for the reasons you laid out. First and foremost, we believe that the work that we're doing there will enhance water quality, which is a critical part of our mission. The economic vitality of the Sound is important to you, important to us to demonstrate that environmental protection and economic prosperity are not mutually exclusive. They go hand in hand. And in this case, there's a direct connection to the work that we want to do in terms of our investments in water infrastructure, especially in the area you identified, which is if we're going to improve in the area of stormwater and flooding, we've got to take a look at what we're doing on the side of working with Puget Sound and looking at some of the natural remedies that we can begin to invest in. And so we look forward to continuing to partner there.
I appreciate that. I recognize that if we're going to effectively recover the sound, we need a coordinated approach that includes more federal resources and more authorities to complement the efforts of our state and of our tribes. I'm proud to lead a bill here in Congress called the Puget SOS Act to ensure that the federal government steps up to be a better partner that state and tribal and local entities need to save our sound, and to assist some of those regional efforts to restore salmon and orca populations, to ensure that future generations can dig for clams, and to uphold tribal treaty rights. That bill passed the House with strong bipartisan support last Congress, so I hope that we can count on your partnership and your support for getting across the finish line this Congress. I also want to just add, I know my state is petitioning the Biden administration to ensure that funding from the American Rescue Plan can be used to fix culverts. And again, would certainly invite you to weigh in favorably there, because that can help the sound and it can grow a bunch of jobs. So I guess I'd love to just tee up those issues for you. And on top of that, if there are other EPA funding streams that could help there, we would certainly welcome that help with an eye towards saving the sound and saving some of the species that depend on it.
Absolutely. I'll assure you and commit to you that we look forward to the partnership. As a former state secretary, I know that state and locals know their communities much better than the federal government ever could. We have to have an effective partnership, and I look forward to thinking through how we can leverage state, federal, and local resources so that we're using the resources and the investments in the most impactful way to preserve the environment, but grow the economy and create economic stimuli at the local level.
Thanks very much. I see I'm out of time. We would welcome you up in our neck of the woods. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Pleased to recognize Mr. Simpson for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Chair Pingree. I appreciate the opportunity, and welcome, Administrator Regan. You come highly recommended, and I look forward to working with you. I've had a great relationship with the EPA over the years, and we've actually worked with local communities to find solutions to solve some of the problems. If you look at the city of Boise, they had to reduce their phosphorus levels going into the Boise River, and they came up with a plan that was different than what the EPA had originally recommended and much cheaper. And the EPA looked at it and said, you know, this might work. So the EPA got behind it, and they created what was called the Dixie Drain, which is doing a great job in cleaning up the river. So working with the EPA and local communities, I think we can find solutions to some of these problems. But let me just say, as long as everybody else is inviting you, I would invite you to visit the Great Lakes of Idaho. We have some Great Lakes there too. So I'd invite you to do that. And I'm certainly happy to hear that that Congressman Kilmer is interested in saving orca and salmon, because there are some proposals to do just that. But let me ask you, I've often heard from mayors and city officials who come to me in need of help because of their cities are out of compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act or the Clean Water Act, or both, due to the aged water utility infrastructure. And the cost of replacement and repairs is crippling to these small municipal communities, not only in Idaho, but in North Carolina and other places. I'm sure you're well aware of that. Even with STAG grants and stuff, they have a really difficult time trying to do their match to repair their water infrastructure. What can the administration do to assist these small communities in their pursuit of compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act?
You have hit the nail on the head, and so many of our local communities are struggling in this area because we have not invested in our water infrastructure in such a long time. And part of the strategy for the increase in our 2022 budget and in looking at the President's American Jobs Plan addresses exactly this. We need to have some investments in these communities directly, financially, in terms of low interest loans, but also there are a lot of communities that cannot afford the loan route, that we need some grant economic stimuli as well. But it's more than financial, as you know. What we do at EPA and what we did in the state of North Carolina is along with the financial help, there are also educational tools that many of these managers need in terms of how to train the workforce and recruit the appropriate workforce to manage these new systems. They're facing threats from cybersecurity just as much as they are from climate change. And so we need to build a healthy water infrastructure for economic development reasons, as well as for safe drinking water. And that's what we want to do with these resources.
Well, I appreciate that. I look forward to working with you. And of course, the Rural Water Program is very important across this country because they help these small communities develop the personnel to work in these facilities and water treatment facilities and wastewater treatment facilities and stuff. So the rural water program is vitally important, I'm sure, all across the country, not just in Idaho. But I look forward to working with you on this. One other question I have is, during the Obama administration, we always heard consistent concerns from farmers and ranchers and businesses and governors and many others about the extremely broad definition of waters of the United States under the Clean Water Act. I was pleased when the EPA and the Corps took note of those concerns and rewrote the rule in a way that maintains critical protections under the Clean Water Act. The future of this rule is now uncertain. I am hoping you can shed some light on what the administration plans regarding the navigable waters rule and how you plan on hearing the concerns of Idaho farmers and ranchers as you make these decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I spent a lot of time on this topic in North Carolina as the DEQ secretary. And I've met with a lot of the ag industry CEOs on this topic since I've been EPA administrator. We all believe that the courts weighed in on the Obama rule and that the courts have weighed in on Trump's navigable waters rule. We've learned from both instances. What I'm pledging to do is begin a stakeholder engagement process involving our ag community, Farm Bureau, or ag CEOs, our environmental community, to look at the lessons learned and how we can move forward. And I'm interested in moving forward, not in a ping pong way, but a way that we can provide some certainty to the ag industry where we don't overburden the small farmer, but we also balance the protection of our wetlands and our sounds and estuaries. And so I believe we can do it. I just think we need to have more touch points and conversations. And Secretary Vilsack and I are attached at the hip in terms of a strategy to get this done.
Well, thank you. I look forward to working with you on this and many other issues that come before the EPA. And as I said, you come highly recommended, and look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. I'm pleased to recognize Mr. Harder for 5 minutes.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Administrator Regan, congratulations on your appointment. Very much excited to work with you. I wanted to talk about air quality. My region in the Central Valley of California has the highest rates of childhood asthma in the entire country. I had childhood asthma as a kid, and my brother did. It's incredibly common in our neck of the woods. We live in a valley where much of the air pollution that exists all over California sort of settles in our neck of the woods, and even some from overseas. I know the administration is proposing a new project, $100 million for improvements in air quality, and I'd love to hear a little bit from you how you view that as working out in practice, and more generally, how you see the EPA's rules at not just setting high standards for air quality, which I agree we need to be doing, but even more helping local communities like ours come into compliance with those standards and actually remediate in communities like ours, which have challenges with air quality stemming decades in the past.
Oh, well, thank you for that question. And regrettably, I grew up using an inhaler as well, so I know all too well what that feels like and the implications of that. What the administration wants to do is program resources to focus on air quality monitoring, but do it in a way where we're not rebuilding the federal air quality monitoring system solely, that we are leveraging resources and passing through grants and investments to state and tribal entities so that we can provide some flexibility in terms of what we're seeing on the ground and how states and tribes can help on the compliance end. A lot of times we spend a lot of resources on enforcement. And the reality is that enforcement mechanism is only as good as the rule. And many of our rules may or may not be as transparent as possible and or maybe harder from an administrative burden standpoint. So we're not achieving the environmental goals we're looking for. The resources in the FY 2022 budget, as well as the American Jobs Plan, focuses on where those air quality needs are the most. And by the way, I have to say climate change is an important issue, but in tackling climate change and leveraging technology and looking at the monitoring we're talking about, you get the air quality benefits. The public health component of this is so important and I think is lost in the discussion. So the short answer to your question is these resources are dedicated to more air quality monitoring, technical assistance to comply with our regulations, and the ability for EPA to rely more on our local partners to help us with the environmental goals we're looking for.
Thank you for that. I'd love to dig in further as you continue to develop the budget proposal and figure out exactly where those dollars end up going, especially in a big state like California. Having those dollars go to California is great, but given there's 53 congressional districts, we want to make sure that it's going to the communities that are hit hardest by the challenges in air quality today. And we look forward to working with you. I would also just mention a quick plug for a bill that we've developed called the Farm Act, which is all around the intersection of air quality and agriculture, and how do we actually help farmers and give them tools to alleviate some of the challenges that we're seeing in communities like mine. I believe it is one of the only bills, if not the only bill in Congress endorsed by both the Farm Bureau and the League of Conservation voters. And it actually, I think, is somewhat similar to some of the efforts that you're talking about when you're talking about environmental justice and some of the efforts that you're trying to do to clean up pollution. Can you talk a little bit about the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act grant program and how you think some of the money going into to that will help communities and address especially some of the marginalized communities that we're seeing?
Absolutely. We're spending a lot of time looking at where technology is going and where the markets are going in terms of electric vehicles. But there's a stark reality here that we're making progress on technological advancements using biofuels and better technologies around diesel emission reduction strategies as well. In order to reach our goals, it's an all hands on deck approach. There are electric vehicles, there's advanced diesel technology, and there are biofuels in the mix. And I'm spending time not only with the agriculture community, but also with the automakers to think about how we make this shift in a way that benefits the environment, but the jobs follow the transition as well. It's a very important conversation and look forward to having many more with you on that very topic. I'm sorry, you're muted.
With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now I'm muted. Thank you for your questions. I'm pleased to recognize Mr. Stewart for 5 minutes for his questions.
Okay, thank you. My phone just fell over, so if I'm sideways, hopefully my phone resets. Administrator, welcome. We look forward to working with you. You know, one of the fun things to do is to review people's biographies when they come before us. And there's a couple things in yours that I'd like to mention. One is Goldsboro, one of the most beautiful towns in the country. My first assignment in the Air Force was at Langley Air Force Base, and we spent a lot of time in that part of the world, and Goldsboro was one of the places we visited. We have a background as well, similar. Your father was a colonel. My father was as well, although they fought in different wars. My dad was World War II, and your father was Vietnam. But both of us come from military families, and I think that gives us something in common as well. And finally, you love hunting and fishing. That's why. That's one of the reasons that many of us live in the West, is because we love the outdoors. I love to ski and rock climb and to, you know, enjoy the things that both of us are trying to protect. And so we look forward to working with you as we do try to find bipartisan and effective ways that we can protect the environment and the things that we love. I'd like to ask you something, and it goes back to the previous administration, but it's a policy that I know you're familiar with, and that's the Obama administration's Waters of the U.S., which became a very troubling and actually very controversial issue, particularly in the West. Salt Lake City, which we represent a core part of the city, we get, you know, maybe 12 or 14 inches of rain a year. I mean, in North Carolina, that's a month's worth of rainfall for you. You know, maybe a couple bad storms even. And to us, as you know, water rights in the West, I mean, they're as precious as gold, and we preserve every drop of water that we can. And we share that goal. Both of us share that interest. But the waters of the U.S. claimed federal jurisdiction, as I know that you know, over virtually every pool of water there was. I mean, there was actually an argument that you could have a pool of standing water in your backyard, and that because it would have some kind of begin the nexus for, a waterway, a navigable waterway, that the federal government could claim jurisdiction over that. And we saw them do that under the previous administration. So I'm asking you, please, for those of us who share this concern, tell us that you're not going to go back and reinforce or try to resurrect the waters of the U.S. policy, and that we can find another way to accomplish the same goal, and that is protect our waterways, protect the precious water, but not have to have such an extreme federal overreach. I'd appreciate your views on this.
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for the commonalities in the introduction. I think you hit the nail on the head, which is there's more that unites us than divides us, and there's always a way we can find forward. Listen, we're committed to moving forward, learning from the lessons of the past. We don't have any intention of going back to the original Obama waters of the U.S. Verbatim, and we don't necessarily agree with everything that was in the Trump administration's version as well. We've learned lessons from both. We've seen complexities in both, and we've determined that both rules did not necessarily listen to the will of the people. I think as I've traveled the state and as I've talked to people all across the country, our agriculture community is not monolithic. We don't look the same all around this country. So we've got to think about what the appropriate way to move forward is. And I've pledged to the environmental community, the ag community, and the like, that we'll chart a path forward on waters of the U.S. that will be inclusive and forward-looking.
Mr. Man, you have made my day to hear you say that. So thank you. And I think you're taking a fair approach in the sense that we can learn from the previous administration, and we can learn from the President Obama's administration as well. And there's probably lessons there that we can move forward with together. And again, thank you for that. In just a few seconds, I won't ask you a question. I'll just maybe highlight something for you. The White Mesa Mill in Utah is the only uranium mill in the United States. Important to know, it is one of the most challenged economic counties in the entire country. Half of the employees at this mill are Native Americans, a population that desperately needs our help and economic opportunities. This critical earths is incredibly important from a national security and an intelligence perspective. Sitting on the Intelligence Committee as well as Appropriations, I understand and work on that intensely. And we look forward to working with the EPA as well as trying to protect the U.S. ability to have access to these rare earths, knowing that they're important economically and from a national security perspective, but we can do so in an environmentally friendly manner. And we look forward to working with you on that as well. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Pleased to recognize Ms. Lee for her 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also like to thank the ranking member and welcome the administrator here. It's a pleasure to meet you virtually. And as my first job out of grad school was working as a contractor for the Department of Justice and the EPA. So it's good to see you. And this is obviously an area of concern for me, which is why I'm happy I'm on this committee. I was encouraged to see that the administration is committed to modernizing our drinking water, wastewater, stormwater systems, as well as tackling new contaminants. I come from Nevada, a rather arid, dry state, and we're facing obviously severe challenges with water resources as we are across the arid Southwest. So we are grateful for the agency's support in protecting Nevada's critical and scarce water resources by providing funding for projects that will help us to manage non-point source pollution in our watershed and partnering with local entities like we have with the Las Vegas Wash. As Mr. Regan, as you mentioned in your testimony, water infrastructure projects are major creator of jobs. Can you speak to the connection between the EPA's water infrastructure investment plan and what you foresee with the creation of new jobs?
Absolutely. And I'd like to say that luckily we have a proven track record here where with our water infrastructure grants and loan programs and our state revolving loan funds, we've pushed billions of dollars out and created hundreds of thousands of jobs or helped stimulate hundreds of thousands of jobs over our track record here. And what the president is wanting to do in this 2022 budget and with the Americans Jobs Plan is to help expedite, repairing our crumbling infrastructure, but it will put a lot of people to work. Electricians, pipe fitters, contractors. There are so many engineers, there are so many jobs associated with this need. And by the way, economic development relies on certainty in their drinking water. And so we really see a strong combination of managing, our drinking water, creating jobs, but more importantly, with our wastewater systems, we're seeing lots of pollution in our natural streams and rivers, especially during times of storms. So there's a win-win-win here. We can protect the environment, we can improve public health with clean drinking water, and we can put a lot of people to work with the investments in our water infrastructure.
Well, we're, as a state that has been decimated by this pandemic, we're looking forward to hopefully seeing some of those jobs in Nevada. I want to just turn now to the administration's plan for tackling the climate crisis with respect to national carbon standards for cars. As I'm sure you're aware that emissions are the single largest source of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. And but I do want to say in my home state of Nevada in June of 2020, the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection announced a rulemaking process to evaluate the adoption of low emission and zero emission standards for light duty vehicles. In your testimony, you highlight several ways in which the EPA is reprioritizing addressing climate change with the urgency the crisis demands. Nevada is now one of 17 states in the District of Columbia that has clean car standards pending or adopted. Can you speak to how the EPA incorporates lessons learned from carbon standard implementation at the state level to inform your similar efforts at the federal level?
Absolutely. We respect the statutory authority that we have and that states have. And states like California, have historically the right to lead the way. I mean, the federal government can indeed learn from states, and that's what we plan to continue to do. We're putting out a notice of proposed rulemaking on tailpipe emissions for cars and light-duty trucks, and that will come mid-July. It will be informed by the great work that the states have been doing, but it will also be informed by the conversations we've had with the auto industry and where we're headed with technological advancements. I mean,
Little connectivity issue here.
Hopefully we'll have the administrator right back again.
It's too bad Derek cut off because before this, we were just on the modernization committee, and the one common complaint from nearly everyone is the internet in our village. Having this happen. Oh, there he is.
The modernization committee is going to be hard at work on fixing the Wi-Fi, you guys.
I think it's probably just because, too many people in the building use the Wi-Fi, which is what you're supposed to do, but we have such limited capacity.
I found there when the start of the pandemic, when the girls came home and they're spread out through the house, not only are they on their iPad for work, but then they're on their phone. And I'm down the basement cutting out like this. So finally I went up, I said, you can have one, the iPad or the phone, but get off the house Wi-Fi on the other one.
Hazards of being a member of Congress.
Well, Betty can fill in for him while he's off.
Exactly. Uh, Representative McCollum, we're happy to have you here, but we're waiting. The administrator has a Wi-Fi issue going on right now.
Oh, no.
I'm being informed that he should be back in a couple of minutes, I think.
Well, I want to thank my fellow committee members for understanding. With all the committee hearings going on and people being on them, we've all been in this boat. So I've got defense hearings going on and Democratic and Republican members in other committees. So we're shuffling the chairs here. So.
Okay, I'm going to recess the committee for 5 minutes just to give them a little time to catch up. So we'll look forward to seeing you all back here in 5 minutes.
This is Michael Regan.
We can hear you, Administrator.
The subcommittee will come to order once again, and we are happy to recognize Chair McCollum for 5 minutes for her questions.
Thank you very much, Chair Pingree, and to my fellow committee members. I look forward to when we can all be together again in person. Administrator Reagan, thank you for joining us here today to present a bold budget for the Environmental Protection Agency. It's a welcome change from the previous administration, who repeatedly proposed more than a quarter of the EPA's budget to be cut and eliminating environmental justice programs. I'm proud that we won that fight, and in fact, we increased the EPA's funding during my 2 years as chair when Ms. Pingree was the vice chair. So I'm just thrilled that Chair Pingree will be working with you to get a hefty increase after looking at the president's budget. Administrator Reagan, I was especially pleased to see that President Biden is proposing $936 million for a new accelerating environmental, economic, and justice initiative. The communities that have been marginalized have borne the burden of pollution and climate change, and they need the support, so thank you. I've already seen the commitment happening in my home state in Minnesota, where the EPA Region 5 is requiring our Clean Water Act impaired waters to list to include wild rice lakes and rivers that are impaired by higher levels of sulfate and are endangered to have even more sulfate. So I hope that we can count on you, especially in working with tribal consultation, honoring our trust and treaty obligations, because that's essential for the EPA's implementation of the Biden administration Environmental Justice Initiative. And so I'm just assuming that's a big yes, and I want to thank you for that.
It's a big yes.
Another issue I wanted to put on your radar screen is an effort to have the EPA take a lead on the Mississippi River Restoration and Resiliency strategy. I included language last year in the subcommittee providing $2 million for the EPA to put the agency in the driver's seat in this initiative in coordination with 5 other federal agencies. My staff has discussed the importance of developing this strategy with the White House and CEQ, and I will soon be introducing the corresponding legislation to create a geographic program for the Mississippi River, our national and river, which is known internationally all around the world. This initiative will create the same sort of coordination and bipartisan investment that the Mississippi River corridor that we've seen in the Great Lakes and other regional initiatives. So I would like to be working with your staff as soon as possible to be able to brief my office on the agency's work in response to the report language on the Mississippi River Restoration and Resiliency strategy that was in the House language last year. So we look forward to working with your staff. The big question I have is to ask you for a little bit of an update on the agency's work on PFAS. As chair of this subcommittee, I was proud to provide the EPA with the increased funds for the scientific and regulatory work to establish drinking and clean water standards for PFAS. That work continues to be incredibly important to me as the chair of the Defense Subcommittee, as I want to ensure that the DoD is cleaning up its PFAS contamination to levels that fully protect the health of our service members, their families, and surrounding communities. Can you give me an update on the EPA's work on PFAS and how it will guide cleanup actions at the DoD, as well as state, local, and private industry responsibilities? We want one great standard, and I don't want the DoD to have a weakened standard.
Well, thank you for that question. And coming from North Carolina, one of the most military-friendly state in the country, I recognized from the beginning that EPA needed to have a positive relationship with DoD. And so Secretary Austin and I have already committed to meet on this topic. We've had some conversations, some general conversations, but we're getting together soon to discuss how EPA and DoD can work together to tackle the PFAS issue. We're forging ahead, leveraging the expertise that we have at the agency to look at setting a drinking water standard. And the importance of this FY 2022 budget and the increases that we're seeing there is to give us the resources to continue the scientific work that we need to conduct, as well as the resources to help spearhead remediation and cleanup as well. And so remediation, cleanup, scientific integrity to help inform the drinking water standard, and partnerships and proactive conversations with the Secretary of Defense is where we're headed.
Well, thank you for that. I think that you're going to see a lot of activity is starting to percolate up again on PFAS, and it tends to be very almost nonpartisan with some members. And I know Ms. Pingree and I have talked about this. We've sent a letter to the Biden administration along with the Oversight Chair of Energy and Commerce, Ms. DeGette. And the three of us are going to work together on this. So we look forward to working with you. And in my case, I look forward to working with Secretary Austin. So Madam Chair, thank you for the indulgence. And I will let you get back to your great work, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much for your questions. And thank you, Administrator Regan. If you're willing to stick around, I think there are a few members who'd like to ask a second question. So I will recognize myself for the first 5 minutes. I want to go back to the topic of environmental justice. It's something that Chair McCollum just talked about a little bit. It's come up in the conversation, and it's certainly a great concern. And so we're very pleased to see the Biden administration and your agency put a focus on this. This has been a priority for the subcommittee. We made advancing environmental justice a priority, increasing the funding for the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice by 75% over 2 years, and also boosting funding for programs like brownfields remediation and DERA. It's certainly a discriminatory practice. We find these industrial corridors and landfills being located in low-income communities and communities of color, and particularly with this administration's focus on the environment and on climate change, we have to have a new lens. So I'd love to hear your perspective on how we best tackle this. And I want to talk a little bit in more detail about the $936 million for the EPA's new Accelerating Environmental and Economic Justice Initiative. Can you just talk about it in a little greater detail? I think it's an important thing for us all to understand better and to know how important it is to tackle it.
Absolutely. This is a central piece of our work, environmental justice and equity. And you know, the big part of it is we have so many communities all across the country that have been disproportionately impacted and left behind. The disproportionate impact from a health impact standpoint, just as much as an economic standpoint. The resources that we plan to use will focus on grant opportunities, education and outreach, and ways that we can think about helping these communities as we bolster the protection for water quality and air quality, but also many of the very industries that are disproportionately impacting these communities are the lifeline economically for these communities. And so we're wanting to work together hand in hand to be ensure that the polluters don't get away, but also that we think about how these industries coexist better with these communities. So there's an environmental transition that we're looking at, but we're also looking at an economic transition. And I believe that these go hand in hand. I believe that we need to spend time in our states with these communities, with these industries, and we can prove that environmental protection and economic prosperity are not mutually exclusive, but go hand in hand, and everyone can be treated fairly.
That's great. And I think that is such an important perspective. So thank you for that. One other aspect about this is one of the defining characteristics of economic justice communities is they often bear a disproportionate pollution burden compared to other communities. It seems to me that we have limited mechanisms within our environmental laws to factor in the cumulative health effects of multi-pollutant exposures in a community. And I think that's an important thing to change. Could you outline some of the ways that the agency would be addressing cumulative impacts in its work? And how can we partner with you to give you the tools to make sure we're able to do that?
That's an excellent question. And, you know, I've instructed every office at EPA to take a look at how environmental justice and equity fits within their programs, not just from a rhetoric standpoint, but in terms of the very DNA of the work that EPA does here. And I think we do have tools that we can better leverage to look at the multiple impacts that multiple industries may have each and every time the federal government or state makes a decision in terms of permitting these entities. But we need to do more. We need to do more in terms of enforcement on our side. We need to do more in terms of technical assistance that we provide to local economic developers so that they can take these cumulative impacts into considerations when they recruit industries. And we need to do more partnering with our legislative bodies to think through, if we don't have all of the statutory authority we need to address cumulative impact in the most expedient way, we're working with you to develop the laws that will govern that.
Great. Well, I do appreciate that, because I think that, all too often we look at, a single impact of a toxic chemical or of a bad air, bad water, but don't understand that in certain communities, people are being bombarded by multiple, levels of toxicity. And we often, have such rigid standard or limited ability to understand that. So I'm thrilled that it's an important issue to you, and I really look forward to the committee and this Congress giving you the tools that you need to deal with that. So I will yield back and happy to recognize Mr. Joyce if he has a second round of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Administrator, given education is a proven tool to increase recycling participation, strengthening recycling streams, and reducing pollution, as co-chair of the House Recycling Caucus, I'm proud to also co-lead H.R. 5906, the Recycle Act, to help protect our invaluable natural resources. The Recycle Act would create a new EPA grant program to help states, tribes, local governments, nonprofits, and public-private partnerships educate households and consumers about the residential and community recycling programs. In FY21, Congress provided up to $1.5 million to support these efforts at the agency. Can you describe how the agency plans to use this funding in FY21, and how will these efforts also benefit the environment and the economy?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's such an important question, and we're spending a lot of those resources focused on education, outreach, and partnering with our state and tribes and local communities to educate them not only on the environmental disbenefits of plastics, but the economic opportunities, the circular economy aspects of this. I just sat down with a group of young people 2 weeks ago, and second to climate change, plastics and the circular economy were top of their list. I spent time with my Japanese counterpart on an international call, and this was top priority for Japan as well. There are so many advantages here, and what EPA wants to do is do a better job partnering with our state and local and international partners to reduce the impacts that we see plastics having on our marine life, on our food sources, but thinking about how in a circular economy fashion, we can begin to tackle this as well.
Well, could you explain what recycling challenges these entities currently face? And could additional funding broaden the community outreach, awareness, and education to address and educate on recycling to increase recycling participation?
We're taking a very close look at that. I can tell you from my experience in North Carolina, a lot of it is access in our rural communities in terms of where to drop off the recycling materials, how you aggregate those recycling materials so that it makes sense from a cost-effective standpoint for local municipalities to invest in these programs. We really have to take a look at how we empower our local communities to see the leverage points and the economic opportunities for pulling plastics out of circulation. And so I believe that education and outreach is a significant way we can provide technical assistance and resources to our state and local partners to tackle this challenge.
Well, thank you. And, I view that, and, obviously the lakes is a big issue. And one of the other problems that we have, despite increased GLRI funding, significant work to reduce non-point source pollution and efforts to mitigate impacts the human activities have had on the Great Lakes, we continue to hear reports about the growing threat of harmful algal blooms in the Great Lakes, as well as down in the Everglades and other areas throughout the country. Now, how could adjusting the allocation of GLRI funds to these various focus areas like nutrients and habitat potentially help accelerate harmful algal blooms reduction efforts?
It's a very critical question. And one of the things that we want to do a better job at EPA is not operating in silos, but having all of our programs leverage their expertise and resources to tackle this. And I think as we think through how we engage our agricultural partners and look at the efficiencies in terms of ag management, pesticide applications, fertilizers and the like, that's one example of where the ag community sees more efficient management of farming as an opportunity for us to quantify significant water quality impacts that we're looking at as well. And so I think we have to look across our programs, leverage our resources, and really focus on nutrient management in a way that balances our overall goals.
And I have a little bit of time left, but I don't want to have you sit around for another round, so let me just finish quickly. Could additional restoration progress be made by investing in innovative projects like natural infrastructure project designs, like wetlands, technologies or approaches that yield nutrient and harmful algal bloom reduction benefits at landscape scales?
Absolutely, and that's a critical piece of why we want to take a look at how to have a stakeholder engagement process that reevaluates waters of the U.S. In a way that, again, doesn't overly burden the small farmer, but look at the important role wetlands play in filtering pollutants. There's such a strong connection there, and these natural approaches to protecting water quality are critical because they're more resilient to storms and they're more cost effective than some of the man-made solutions like terminal growings and others.
I certainly believe that the wetlands are nature's kidneys, and we need to continue to develop and work on them as best we can. I realize I'm well out of time, and thank you very much for allowing me these questions today, Madam Chair.
Absolutely. Thank you for your questions and that important metaphor about nature's kidneys. That's a good way to describe it. So, Chair Capter, we are very pleased to see you and happy to yield to you for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, very much. And I want to add my word of congratulations to the new administrator of EPA. We look forward to working with you. And the district that I represent is out in a mud puddle, out in the middle part of the country. And this is Western Ohio. There's Michigan up here, Indiana over here, and here's Lake Erie. Congressman Joyce, my dear friend, lives somewhere over here. But I wanted to show you this because Congressman Joyce, Ranking Member Joyce, indicated the problem with the nutrient runoff into Lake Erie. And our problem is also political in that one of the poorest cities in the country, Toledo, which sits about here, and their wastewater treatment plant, the bill for cleaning up water and sewage in the region is placed on Toledo, and Toledo has to draw its clear water from Lake Erie, but the pollution comes from a region much bigger than Toledo. And my first question really goes to a Clean Watersheds Needs Survey that was done that talks about wastewater infrastructure across our country and what the backlog has grown to, creeping toward $500 billion. In Ohio, they say we need about $14 billion in wastewater infrastructure. The largest county in my district, which is Cuyahoga County, Cleveland, has a $2.9 billion unmet construction need. As we look toward a Build Back Better agenda, how can our country confront a reckoning with race and poverty without addressing the unfairness of the massive financial obligations placed on communities like Cleveland, like Toledo, like Detroit, where they had to shut off the fresh water to people, and more people caught COVID-19 because of that? It's really, EPA is great, and I'm a city and money that we need to do this. So we either have to innovate our way out of this, or you have to get more power somehow, but you put obligations on communities And then what happens is people can't afford their water bills and their utility bills. So what they've done in the city of Toledo, because people can't pay the bills, rather than sending the bills quarterly, they're now sending them every month. So people are getting a utility bill every month because it's a smaller bite, but over a year, it's a bigger total. This is really a system doomed to fail. And I hope that, and it is failing, I hope that EPA will be a really big voice in the Build Back Better, and that we will figure out a way to lift some of this burden off of communities. Billions of dollars in unpaid bills due for infrastructure improvements, and they simply don't have the money. They've lost out millions of jobs in our region. So how are communities supposed to do this? So I think we need your vision to place responsibility where it belongs. And how do you do that when there's no political boundary for the watershed that's causing the problem? And then how do you help the poor cities that are being asked to clean everything up, and their taxpayers and ratepayers are being sent these bills to a point where we're shutting off thousands of people's water because they can't afford the bills? This is not a workable solution. Do you have any thoughts about how you're being included in the Build Back Better discussions at the White House? I think the federal government should lift this bonded indebtedness off these communities.
Well, thank you for that question. I did not see the visual, but I have it in my head imagining it. Listen, we're front and center in the American Jobs Plan. We're front and center in the 2022 budget that we are requesting. The president's wisdom has shown that the $111 billion that we're asking for to help improve the country's water systems, wastewater, stormwater, replacement of lead pipes, it is an aggressive and an ambitious number, but the facts are that out of that $111 billion, it's a small down payment because there are $743 billion worth of needs in this country. And so we've got to move forward in a very aggressive way to begin jumpstarting the infrastructure repair that needs to occur for not only water quality needs, as you've laid out, and environmental justice needs, but to put jobs in those same communities as well. So we want to use the $111 billion from the American Jobs Plan. We want to use the increases from the 2022 budget, but we also want to use the environmental justice and equity dollars that are in both of these requests to marry this so that those who are most impacted will see the benefits of water quality and jobs first.
Well, thank you, Administrator Reagan. I wanted to suggest, if you haven't visited the DC water facility here, I was absolutely fascinated with my visit there, because I've been wondering, how can I reduce these bills on the communities I represent, and frankly, for the whole country? And I think we need a different business model. They have a new business model. And their business model is they are turning the biggest consumer of energy in the city of Washington, which is the treatment of water and sewage, into an energy utility. And they are doing it by not just drawing down power from the grid, but they are producing power. And they are producing power through a thermal heat exchange system where they will then replicate kind of what was done in the old steam systems that existed across cities, connect every building adjacent to them, and use the differential in temperature to actually produce power for the first time from sewage and water reclamation. And they are on task to become an energy utility. I chair an energy and water subcommittee in the Congress. When I saw that, I thought, whoa, how do I get that to Cleveland? How do I get that to Lorraine? How do I get that to Toledo, to Buffalo, to all these places that are struggling under these gigantic debt loads? And I would encourage your staff to look at the bonded indebtedness across the Great Lakes and other regions of the country. But I think this DC group they are onto something transformational, and they are turning their wastewater treatment facility into an energy utility. They are adding solar, and they've already got the geothermal. I'm sure they're going to add more. It is, I think it's revolutionary. Doesn't exist anyplace else in the United States. I think other cities, Denver and others, are looking at it. but I just commend it to your attention because we've got to break the mold on 20th century thinking. We just can't achieve the objective and appropriated dollars aren't enough. But I think if we can look at these generators of power, including these water and sewage treatment plants, I think we're into a different era. So I just wanted to share that vision with you, and also to say, in terms of, I'm sure Mr. Joyce has talked many times about the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. On the committee that I chair, every year the Bureau of Reclamation for 17 Western states gets $1 billion off the top of appropriated dollars to help with the drying West, right? We're lucky in the GLRI if we get 250 million, sometimes 330 million. I think one time they got 500 million, maybe back when President Obama was in office. But we're not in the same playing field. And we got the water. We got 95% of the fresh surface water in the country. Somebody better be thinking about it. And for future generations. So help us get on a level playing field. And I thank you very much for listening. I don't have that clock on I can't tell if I've gone overtime. So I don't know where it is on the screen, but I apologize if I've gone overtime. And I thank you very much for listening.
It's fine, Chair Captor. You've gone over time, but it was well worth it. And it's always good to wrap up with talking about the Great Lakes. And you've mentioned that facility in DC a couple of times, and I think we're going to just have to have a field trip to see it because it definitely sounds impressive. So thank you so much, Administrator Regan and Deputy Bloom, for appearing before our committee and answering our questions. We really appreciate that. Look forward to partnering with you. And if there are no additional questions, this hearing is now adjourned.